there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have what I think is an exclusive, which is returning guests Bob Budiansky and Simon Furman, both of whom are the writers on the US and UK versions of Transformers, the series that was put out by Marvel and Marvel UK back in the 80s and early 90s. And why are they here? Besides being excellent conversationalists and talking about Transformers, which we always want to talk about, there is a new Kickstarter from Skybound, and it has the compendium of all of this original material written by mostly these two guys. And it is a fantastic set. We encourage you to go to Kickstarter and look it up, support it. Digital, physical, these things are big. They're really like omnibuses that can definitely stop a door. But they are great, and we get into sort of the origins of everything Transformers in comics. So let's get to it. This is Bob Budiansky and Simon Furman. Today we are thrilled to talk with Bob Budiansky and Simon Furman about Transformers, especially given that Skybound is now kickstarting these huge compendiums, which you will see in the background if you're on YouTube behind Simon's head, for both the US and UK series. Bob, Simon, thank you for both for being on the show.
Pleasure being here.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, to start out, we're going to kind of do a rewind and get to the history of Transformers and Transformers comics. And I'd love to know if you can recall the sequence of events that led a toy line in Japan to cross the ocean, land at Hasbro, and then on your desk at Marvel.
Well, I can't recall all of that since I wasn't involved in most of it. I can approximate some of it. So Marvel, as it had done previously, makes a deal with another company to license its product to make comic books. So my impression is that Hasbro approached Marvel, as they had a couple of years earlier with G.I. Joe, and said, we have this new toy line. Marvel, we would like you to develop the toy line into a story, develop these characters, and make it into a comic book eventually. I was not involved in any of those discussions. I was a staff editor at the time. It was not my purpose to be negotiating licensing deals with major toy companies. Eventually, I guess the deal was made, and eventually it came down to editorial. Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief at the time. This is in fall of 1983. And unbeknown to me, again, I'm not involved yet, Jim had developed a treatment or a backstory to explain who the Transformers are and what the conflict is between the Autobots and the Decepticons, to kind of create a whole basis of the Transformers mythology, and everything kind of grew out of that. So once he had that down, and I guess he showed it to Hasbro and they were fine with it, or he tweaked it a little or whatever. Eventually he went to a writer who was a staff editor, also a senior editor, and asked him to develop the characters. And there were 26 initial toy characters that we needed to have names and personality profiles developed. And for reasons that, again, I was not involved yet, for reasons I do not know, Jim Shooter did not approve of what that writer-editor submitted, okay? And rather than go back to him and say, hey, can you revise all this stuff, he looked for another person to handle developing the character profiles and the character names. So anyway, he went to a few other editors who had more experience as a writer than I did, and they all turned him down. And I know Larry Hama, since I mentioned him earlier, I think, well, he developed G.I. Joe. He was one of those people who turned Jim Shooter down, probably because he was too busy doing G.I. Joe, and he was an editor also. So anyway, eventually, I'm sure out of an act of pure desperation, Jim came to me. So I was an editor, but I was known more as an editor who drew. I was an artist editor. And he came to me and he said, okay, Bob, we have this property called Transformers, 26 characters, 26 toys that need to be developed into characters. can you do it? And can you do it over a long weekend? Basically, it was like a Wednesday or a Thursday. He needed everything by Monday, and it was right before Thanksgiving of 1983. So at that point in the calendar year, a lot of editors are just trying to wrap up their projects so they can take off for Thanksgiving and go back home wherever they live. And probably that's why a couple of them turned them down, but they didn't have the time to add this to their already cluttered schedule. But I wasn't doing anything that weekend. So that's how I got involved. I said, sure, I'll do it. And so Monday morning I turned in 24 out of 26 names. Two of the names I did inherit from the previous writer editor who would handle the job. And anyway, 26 character profiles and the additional 24 names. And Jim liked it, and he sent it off to Hasbro, and I guess they liked it. And after a few tweaks here and there, mostly on character names that didn't pass legal for one reason or another, that was it. That was my involvement. That's how I got started.
And this was initially for the actual toy line, right? This wasn't necessarily for, I mean, it would form the basis, obviously, for the comics, but you were developing these names and backstories so that the packaging, when Transformers came out from Hasbro, had all of this material. Is that right?
Uh, well, that's how it worked out. I don't even know if I realized at first that my profile would be used for the packaging, but eventually I slimmed them down a bit so that they could fit on the packaging. Like I revised them and abbreviated them so that they could fit. So I'm not sure if I even knew initially that that we use it for the toy packaging. But I did know that the names I came up with would be the names of the toys. That much I did know. And I did know that all of this would be uh, leading up to a comic book. That was Marvel's main concern.
Of course.
We weren't there to sell toys, but that was our purpose from Hasbro's point of view. Our purpose was to sell comic books. So all of this was part of a deal where Marvel would turn this potential winning toy into a comic book, which we had no idea if it would be a popular toy or not.
And Simon, when did you catch wind of Transformers as a concept? Was it toys that eventually made it over, or did you know this was all happening at the time in the US Marvel?
No,
Uh,
it was, a bit like Bob, it was purely a work arrangement. I got invited into Marvel UK. I knew one of the editors there, and he knew that the editor of Transformers UK, which was going to reprint the Marvel US stories, needed writers. So he just put me and the editor together. I'd never heard of Transformers at this point. It may well have been on TV, I don't know. Um, but certainly the first, mini series was out by this point, so I could be given, photostats of that and sit and read it. But I really just came in cold to it. And to me, it was just a job. It was like, okay, yeah, it's great. And obviously, there was a great sheaf of paper, which was all Bob's, basically all the characters were there. It sort of made it easy in many ways. It was just like, great. If I'm going to come up with a story, here's the characters, and the story can more or less spin out of that. And our little brief was we had to kind of do no harm to the American storyline. So
Sorry.
stories had to sort of fit in between cracks in the Marvel series. So between issues almost sometimes, or at any pause, we could then drop in a run of stories. And the reason for this was um, the UK comic was fortnightly and then very rapidly weekly, as opposed to monthly, which was happening with the Marvel US comic. So, we needed more material. And, I didn't actually write the first story. That was written by a writer called Steve Parkhouse and drawn by John Ridgway and Mike Collins. That was Man of Iron. And that one really did sit slightly apart from the storyline. It was very sort of steeped in British myth and legend, so it didn't really impact at all on what was happening. And that was the thing, we couldn't do something like I don't know, Optimus Prime loses an arm, and then the next time he turns up in one of Bob's stories, the arm's back. So, we had to be very aware of what was coming up and how our stories might impact on that.
And there was differences in terms of format, right? I mean, you already spoke about it being fortnightly and then weekly, but also I believe it was different dimensions and it was sort of an anthology. So you had the reprints, but also some backup features and other things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it was more the format of British comics, really. British comics by nature, for the news agents and everything, were never really just one story. They were mostly multiple stories. So Transformers broke the US issues in half and did 11 pages per issue. And then, yeah, they had backups in the shape of, I think it was initially Machine Man they ran. Something, I
Yeah.
think they just looked at whatever else, slightly mech or sort of somewhat toy related within the Hasbro, umbrella of properties that was also a comic that they could run. And yes, it was a
Right.
larger format. It was more like A4 as opposed to a standard, American Marvel comic.
Right. We've danced around it a little bit, but obviously there was an animated series that came out of the toy line as well. I, if I remember correctly, Bob, you've never seen it. Um, was that just developed in parallel with the comics? There was just you guys were going straight ahead with the comics and over wherever animation was happening, they're just going straight ahead with the animation.
I think I remember one meeting where I had a meeting early on with Hasbro and some executives from Sunbow Productions who produced the animated TV show. And that was my entire connection to it. Now, indirectly, any material that I sent to Hasbro that they approved, like all of these character names and character profiles, I guess they passed that material on to Sunbow Productions so that their writers of their shows can, have access to it. Their characters would have the same names as the characters I was using in the comic book, etc. But really, I was not involved in any of that communication. And the animated uh, TV show did its thing, and the comic book did its thing. And Hasbro, was obviously they're the ones who own the product, the Transformers. So if they had any input on coordinating what was going on between the comic book and the animated TV show, that was really entirely up to them. I was never told you have to do this because we're showing this in the animation, or to my knowledge, I don't think the animated TV show was told to do something because it was in the comic book. We were pretty independent of each other. And quite frankly, it would have been very unwieldy, especially in those pre-internet times, to try to coordinate anything like that.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. Now I would imagine that you would have sort of mandates from on high to coordinate it all so that everything
Perhaps,
was
yeah.
going, was coordinated, like you say. Um, but let's
I mean,
talk
just a
about,
little aside. I mean,
yeah,
what I hear from fans over the years, and I don't know if this is a scientifically sound survey of any sort, but they come up to me and they said, I started out watching the animation, and then eventually I started reading the comic books, and there's so much more in the comic books, and the characters are so, they're more developed or more mature or whatever. I mean, it seems like the show gave them one view of the Transformers, comic book gave them a different view. And it seems like a lot of fans appreciate it, but without a doubt, more people probably saw the animation than read the comic book over the years.
Sure. I mean, it was pitched younger. It definitely was. I mean, we were given some VHS cassettes of back in the day of some, maybe the first three episodes of the show, and immediately we sort of all looked at each other and said, "Well, we don't need to go along with that, really." It was just pitched younger, and it didn't really suit the kind of UK comics buying audience we were wanting to attract.
And I wanted to talk to both of you about constraints when writing the series, because I'm sure you had some constraints, and sometimes those are actually beneficial in terms of focusing story, but maybe not in this case. Bob, could I start with you? You know, you have your after the miniseries, well, what just kind of turned into the regular series. You wrote a bulk of those remaining issues, I think over 50 of them. What storytelling challenges did you face trying to maintain a comic based on a toy that was constantly introducing new characters and new, sort of variations on characters? Was there a um, mandate or a request to get certain characters into the book?
You really hit the nail on the head there, Mike. Yeah, so exactly that. Basically, as I said a little earlier, Hasbro looked at the comic book as a way to sell toys. And so anytime, I mean, obviously the Transformers became very successful very quickly. So from that initial 26 characters that were in the initial batch of toys, um, after they built on that, and every 3 months or 6 months or whatever, a new line of toys would be presented to me through, from Hasbro. Like, here, we're coming out with, these 20 new toys in September. Please feature them in the comic book. Please was a nice way of saying feature them in the comic book, because that's what they were most interested in. So if a character was initially produced as a toy and they stopped producing it, they didn't care if that character was ever featured again, or if I destroyed that character, and they didn't care because that's not something that they were able to sell anymore. So they were really forward looking in terms of what toys are coming out and show them in the comic book. Now, in most cases, they didn't care so much like you have to do an entire story about every one of these characters, unless it was something major, like the Headmasters was a major direction for them, or Fortress Maximus was a major toy that they wanted to feature, or something like that. So occasionally, whether they told me specifically or I kind of knew like this was a big deal that this character should be, prominent. I forget, but overall, they kept pushing like you got to feature the new characters. They were very nice about it. I kind of knew what the marching orders were. As a writer, it became very kind of a burden after a while to keep finding new ways to introduce another dozen characters into the storyline. Obviously, you can't show everybody. You gotta shove aside all the other ones that you don't need anymore because they're no longer being produced as toys. So initially, I kind of rose to the occasion. I think I came up with new ways to introduce characters, like new ways to get characters to fit into the mythology that had already been established. But after a while, I found it to be, more and more burdensome, and kind of burnt out on coming up with new ways to introduce characters. And I was getting a little frustrated that I would start storylines featuring certain characters, and I'd have to put it aside eventually because I didn't have room to feature those characters anymore. So I don't know if that kind of gets to your question. Those are the biggest constraints. There were other constraints too. I mean, like there were limitations about what we could show in the comic book, um, but I didn't really push the envelope that often. The one time I remember where I pushed the envelope was I laid out a cover, which Jim Lee eventually drew, for like Transformers number 52 or 53, and it featured like this Amazon warrior holding a sword to a Transformer. I forget what character it was. And you saw her, one hand had a sword and the other hand had the head of the Transformer. And connected to that Transformer were connected to that head was a bunch of cables which attach it to the body. So initially, the way I laid out that cover for Jim to draw, and which he followed precisely, give him all credit, um, initially it was just a head that she was holding with a couple of dangling cables, and there was no body attached to it. And Hasbro thought that went a little too far to show a beheaded Transformer in that particular situation. So we had to attach a body to those cables, so it wasn't quite as grisly. But that was about, really, I didn't try to, I knew we were doing this for kids. I didn't try to overdo it. If that was a human, I would never have drawn a cover. I would never have designed a cover like that. But I figured these are robots. There's no blood. You know, there's nothing gory about it, although there's certainly a strong suggestion of goriness when I lay out a cover like that. So that was when I got my wrist slapped a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's motor oil, there's battery fluid,
I
things
could,
like
yes,
that
yeah. There
that
was all sorts
could
of
up the
disgusting
gore
fluid,
if you
all
so
sorts of
choose.
disgusting fluids pouring out of that guy's head. But no, it was fairly tame by a lot of standards of the that you see around these days. But still, it pushed it a little too much.
And Simon, on your end, you've already talked about this a bit, and I just hoping you'll sort of expand on that. You had to work in between the stories from the US comics. So how challenging was it to craft those narratives within those constraints?
Yeah, it was a little limiting, but we had it easier than Bob really because, and especially every character he shoved aside was just somebody we could feature. So because we were relatively confident that nothing major was going to happen with that character in the upcoming issues. So we did take, if Bob moved the Dinobots out of the storyline, we suddenly had a run of Dinobot stories, and so it went. Our constraints were more slightly with the timing and scheduling. Again, the weekly comic, we were, trying not to eat up the US material. So we were getting bigger and bigger runs of UK strip between the US issues or between runs of the US issue. And sometimes that created a problem when we had a really good relationship with Hasbro UK, and they let us tag on to their TV advertising for any new toy line. So there would be the special teams, and then at the end of the little 30-second ad, the cover of a suitably special teams themed comic would flash up. So it was worth its weight in gold for us to be as accommodating as possible and fit in with their toy launches. But special teams posed a problem where the US material was going to fall that introduced the special teams was still maybe a dozen issues away from where they wanted special teams to appear. So we had to come up with a kind of prescient dream that Buster has because he's had the Matrix in his head about this next evolution. But that was worth, like I say, it was worth our the weight in gold to do those things, to take those extra, you know, storytelling twists, just so we could tag on to the TV advertising. And we continued to do that with Hasbro. When they brought out the new leaders, headmasters, we always made sure we had an issue, a UK story right on the money for when they wanted a splashy cover with those characters on it. It was cynical, but it made a lot of sense.
I can't even imagine that coordination happening nowadays. I mean, we've talked about with other creators how difficult it's been to translate the success of the Marvel movies into, Marvel Comics sales and promotion. So I can totally understand if you're getting some airtime, do what you have to do to get the coordination going.
Sure. And one little extra bit on that note, when we got to the new leaders, which was the characters from Transformers, the animated movie, we were told that all Marvel were doing was an adaptation of the movie. So they weren't touching those characters, which gave us scope to expand what we could do with the storylines. So we would flash forward to this future that was in the animated movie. And it was the closest we came to any kind of continuity with the cartoon series that we literally spun stories out of the middle, the end, you know, anywhere we could from that animated movie. And of course, we expected it to be a box office hit. And sadly, I don't think it ever was. It sort of came and went, but we ended up with our kind of cast and our little universe we could explore.
It's certainly a cult hit, but I don't think it was a hit at the time when it came out. You're right. I wanted to ask you both if there was previous to Simon, you taking over the US ongoing series, was there any coordination between your offices in any way, in terms of, storylines or, heads up that this is coming and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we tried to get as much as we could advance notice, and things got so much better once I actually met Bob in person. Marvel UK sent me out to the Marvel US offices on a sort of work trip, come, sort of, we're not going to give you a pay rise this year, so here's a little trip to New York for you. And of course, once Bob and I actually met and we talked, and everything as it does just got so much easier at that point, I think, because we got on very well, and B, suddenly it was like we both had a face and a name, and we understood things a little better about respectively what we were doing. Is
But
that
can
your
I jump
impression,
in?
Bob?
Now, so yeah, we got along great, but I wasn't the person who was trafficking stuff to you, was I? Because
Well, I don't.
that would have been the editorial office.
Yeah, I mean it was, but we were sort of more saying, has Bob got a new plot in yet? Has Bob, got an idea where the next few issues are going? So even though we were dealing and it was trafficked, my the person I wanted to speak to really was you, and
Oh, okay. Well,
it
glad I
all
was there that day.
yeah, it all got much easier after that, it just seemed, because we had some kind of, personal relationship.
The way things worked back then, probably similar to today. Um, the first four issues of the Transformers was a miniseries. I was the editor, so all that material came to me from Hasbro. If it had to go out to somebody, it would probably come out from of my office. I would make copies of whatever, and you probably weren't even involved that early in the whole process, Simon. So with issue 5, I became the writer. I was no longer the editor. It went to actually passed through 3 different editorial offices during the time I was the writer on the book, and so it was completely up to those editorial offices to disseminate whatever information needed to be disseminated. So if a writer, if the British office needed my plots or needed uh, model sheets from Hasbro that showed the latest line of toys that were coming out, typically that I wouldn't, I mean, I might look at that, I might get a copy of it for myself, but I wouldn't be the one mailing it out to anybody. That would be up to the editorial office to coordinate all that. So that's where Simon and, whatever, your office in London would be, connected to as far as getting that material through that particular pipeline.
Sure, I was sort of double timing it as editor and writer, and one of the other editors was editing my comic strips. So I had sort of two hats on at that point. So one of
Right.
those was kind of chasing, in the nicest possible way, chasing the US office for details of upcoming storylines.
Right.
I wanted to ask you both about art and getting the art and the artists onto the title. Um, I guess in your case, Bob, once the miniseries was over, you're not the editor, so you're not necessarily choosing artists, but you may have some insight. How were the artists chose, and were they challenged by the fact that these new characters were sort of constantly moving in and out?
So if you look back at that era of Transformers, these were not people who grew up reading Transformers. So, there's a whole generation or two of artists who grew up reading Transformers and loved Transformers, loved the artwork, loved the characters, and couldn't wait to be a good enough artist that they could draw it themselves one day. These were guys who had been in the comic book industry for literally decades. These were hardly any of them were relatively new to the business. There was maybe one or two exceptions during my time on it. So this was not, I mean, to be honest, be perfectly brutally honest, this was not their first choice of what they wanted to do. Drawing Transformers, and I know I've been drawing more Transformers these days than I ever did when I was working on it back in the 1980s. It's a bitch. You have all this reference material you have to look at, and I mean, I'm sure a lot of artists find it more, it comes more to their, it's easier to them than maybe drawing humans, but for me, it's just the opposite. Drawing humans is far easier than drawing Transformers, because you're coordinating all these shapes and boxes and, physical forms that have to fit together in just the right way so you can accurately depict a particular character, particular toy. It's a lot of work. And I could bet if any of these artists were honest with me, not that I ever wanted to ask them this question, but if they're ever honest, they would have said, I'd rather be drawing a different book. But these were not, it was regular work. It was steady work. They were all, I mean, the main artists that I worked with were initially Frank Springer, and then Herb Trimpe, Don Perlin, Jose Delbo. They were all ultimate professionals. You give them the plot and you give them some reference to look at, and they would do a hell of a job trying to tell the story you wanted them to tell. But again, probably not their first choice of what they would like to draw. Um, and now, as far as artwork for me, like as I mentioned a little earlier, I did the cover sketch for Jim Lee. So through most of the run, not entirely every copy, every book that I worked on, I I generated cover sketches for other artists to draw for the covers because I knew what I wanted on the cover. I would discuss it with my editor, or in the case of the miniseries, I was the editor. Um, and I would come up with an idea and I'd run it by the editor, and once he approved it, uh, we'd send it out to the artist. On a few occasions, I decided I want to draw it myself. So I think I drew about 5 or 6 covers in the entire Transformers run when I was working on the book. Um, so I was capable of doing that, but that wasn't my primary reason to be working on the book. My primary reason was to write the stories, and I had a full-time job as an editor, so adding a cover or two to my schedule was always a bit of a challenge. So there you go.
Simon, what about you?
Yeah, on the UK side, I think it's much the same. You know, we had a great team of artists, and we had to rotate more artists because we were on a weekly schedule. And so we often, if it was, say, a 4-part story, we would have 2 artists involved in that, or, on a longer one, more. So we had quite a team of artists, but I would say pretty much all of them would have rather been drawing, I don't know, Judge Dredd or superhero characters, or maybe even Thundercats, because yeah, as Bob says, they were difficult to draw. Initially in the UK office, we didn't have the animated turnarounds of the character, that showed them from every angle, and in a much streamlined form. So the artists were mostly originally working from the toy pack art and the toys themselves, and maybe if they had VHS tapes of the show. So, we had a bit of a sea change with the art where suddenly we got these turnarounds at around the time of the animated movie, and it made everyone's life a lot easier. But yeah, I would say, we started with artists like Barry Kitson, Brian Hitch, Steve Parkhouse, names who have, gone on to, make great sort of strides in the comics industry. But, you know, this was just what was available. And, jobbing artists weren't too fussed whether they had to draw Transformers or whatever. They needed the work. And, we developed a good team. And, some of those stayed on, like Jeff and a few others, stayed on for, many, many issues on the series.
Simon, we mentioned this already, but you at one point late into the US series took over for Bob. How did you approach making that transition while obviously respecting what had come before?
Yeah, I mean, when Bob handed me the book over lunch in London one day, he was over and just said, as he's alluded to, he was pretty burned out on the book, and would I like to take it over? Obviously, I was writing the UK story, and I guess Bob figured he could clear it with Don was the editor at the time, I think.
Right.
And yeah, we just, it was all very casual in the end, but Bob did put a caveat in there whereby the book's sales aren't great, they're dipping, and it may only last another 4, 5, 6 issues. I didn't care, frankly. I thought, great, this is my door opener with Marvel US, which I was, you know, keen to have. So yeah, I just jumped in, and initially I think the first 4 issues, it carries on the kind of Micromaster storyline that Bob was running at the time. But other than that, I just thought, well, look, if we haven't got many issues, I can't hang around. So it's like bring Megatron back in like the third issue. Um, bring Unicron in the fifth issue, and it was like that. I just thought, just throw it all in there. What's the worst that can happen at this point? And Hasbro didn't seem to mind, and I think we did, you know, put a bit of extra oomph in it that may have given it an extra heartbeat or two, and kept it going to issue 80. But yeah, it was just like, yeah, I just thought, well, hey, what have we got to lose trying everything here, really? And we threw the kitchen sink at it.
Hey, Simon, I have a question for you.
Mm,
Did you worked on it from issue 56 through 80.
mm.
Um, did the comic book outlast the toy line? Because at some point, I think Hasbro stopped producing the toys.
I'm pretty sure there weren't new lines coming out still. I think the comic finished in mid 91, and I think by then there weren't new releases. I'm pretty sure Micromasters was kind of the last big toy release from Hasbro. There may have been a drip of other characters, but we were never asked, as you were, to feature these characters. We were
That
never.
that was kind of my point, which is if they stop producing the toys, Hasbro really doesn't care. I mean, unless you did something, awful, like, violating community standards in some way. Um, they really didn't care what you did with the book if they weren't producing the toys. So you
No.
could, like Simon saying, oh, I think I bring Unicron and I'll bring back Megatron. Whatever it is you wanted to do, you had a lot of free reign to do it, probably, right?
Yeah, I don't think there was a huge amount of oversight by this time. You know, Famously, Rob Tokar was the editor who took over from Don, and I knew Rob well, and we were good friends. We decided just to sort of slightly test the water and see how much attention Hasbro were paying to what we were sending them. So we sent them an April Fool's gag story outline that was just everything in excess. All the characters died. There was a mechanical sheep running around, and Cup was having amorous feelings for it. It was just every sort of gross gag we could put in there. I think there was a nun the size of Galvatron fighting. There was just we just threw everything into this, and Rob took great pains to, in big bold letters, put April 1 whatever at the top of the memo. And Hasbro came back with, uh, we have a few concerns. That was it. That was it. And Rob at that point had to kind of tell them we were just playing a gag on them. And you know what? They loved it. They just thought it was a hoot that we tried this. Maybe people didn't try this with corporate people very often. And so yeah, I don't think the oversight was quite as much as it was by then.
So Simon, I did something very similar years earlier. So around issue 8, I think, I had a story that started off where one of the Autobots, I forget which one, I think it was Ratchet, stumbles upon some college students camping in the woods.
Remember
And
it.
and um, and so the way Marvel worked back then is you wrote a plot and then the artist would read the plot, once the editor approves it, and the artist would draw it, and then you dialogue the plot. You would dialogue the story pages after it was drawn. So I I would have I would have fun with the artist. I would just write my plot, which is like a short story, and I'd throw things in there which a little bit weren't that serious. So I remember writing something like, college students, they're doing normal things in the woods. They have a campfire there. they're roasting hot dogs over the fire. They're having I forget exactly what it was. It was definitely, not G-rated. I said something like they're having, probably similar to what your joke, which was they're having sex with some forest animals or something like that. Hasbro took it seriously. And they got back to me about that. No, 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 you can't do that. So, okay, it was just a joke. Sorry, didn't, but I knew the artist wouldn't draw it. Um, anyway, that taught me a valuable lesson. Don't joke in a plot, because they're not gonna be able. It's like today, when you text people, you didn't have texting back then. When you text people, you have to be careful what you say if you're trying to be sarcastic, because they may not read that way to the person at the other end. So you have to be very clear and plain language, what you're trying to say, and not embellish it like that. So I learned back then, I just have to tell the story, not messing around and throwing jokes to entertain the artist. It's not cool. So it'll just get me in trouble. So should have
Sometimes on
learned
the
from my lesson. I should have told you that story back then.
yeah, yeah.
Better to
Sometimes
joke over the phone than
Yeah, keep it on the
on
phone. Don't
on
put it
a
in writing.
paper record. Yeah,
Don't put
exactly.
it in writing. Yeah, yeah.
sometimes on the UK comic we would put stuff in that it wasn't going to offend anyone or ruffle any feathers, but Hasbro were unlikely to notice that, say we were homaging a page from Killing Joke, Batman the Killing Joke. There's a
Hmm.
scene where Batman and the Joker are just talking, it's heads and different angles, and there's the shadow of Batman's cowl, ears falling on the Joker. We did a literally a panel by panel homage to that page where Ultra Magnus is talking to Soundwave, and Ultra Magnus has these antennae, and they're making the bat ears shadow fall on, and it was brilliantly done. Lee Sullivan did such a beautiful job of it, but we just knew Hasbro would never know or care that we were,
Hmm.
riffing on something else there.
I'd love to know what each of your favorite Transformers to write for was,
You
if you
mean
have one.
which character you mean?
Which character? Yes.
So in my case, it was Blaster, just because some of my best stories, in my opinion, involve Blaster. So I I really got into writing that particular character, and once again, I had to brush him aside because I had to eventually introduce a whole bunch of new characters. So he wasn't, his prominence was short-lived. But that would be my answer.
Yeah, for me, it's probably Grimlock. I loved that character. I thought, there was a lot to be done with a character that seemed fairly two-dimensional. So it was fun to try and add, a few extra layers, not changing anything Bob had done, but maybe suggesting that, a lot of it was a sort of front, that he presented one image, but there was more going on. And yeah, I kind of got to. I mean, it's a robotic T-Rex. What's not to like? But yeah, he was probably my favorite. But some of the other ones later, when I was writing the US book, who hadn't got so much bio or story time, like Nightbeat, say, he was kind of ostensibly a detective. And I took that and ran with it and did a whole Maltese Falcon sort of parallel in one issue with Nightbeat as the focal character. So, a lot of those sort of latter ones where I added a little layer to them became kind of favorites as well.
Were there any characters that you didn't write or didn't have a chance to write a lot of that you would have liked to sort of blow out in terms of personality and story?
I don't remember. It's like um, a phrase from a U2 song. I was running to stand still. It's, in other words, I was just trying to get through that story. I didn't have time to think about, well, I wish I had more time to spend on this character who was from a year ago, who's no longer being produced as a toy, but I have no room for him. I was just kind of like, you know, focused on, okay, this issue, I have to feature these characters, and maybe I could make a couple of them kind of rise to the surface and focus on them and maybe stretch it out over a couple of issues. I don't remember like, oh, I wish I had more time to spend on this character. I probably was thinking of it at the time. Like I mentioned, Blaster was my favorite character to write, and perhaps I would have written more stories featuring him if there wasn't such a large cast of characters to accommodate. But yeah, I can think about, I can barely remember things that I did do. It's hard to remember things I didn't do.
For me,
Simon,
yeah, for me it wasn't anything I noticed at the time. Again, you're just not. You're in the moment and you're writing stories to hit deadlines
Right.
and keep a comic rolling. But latterly I realized looking back, I hardly ever wrote Bumblebee, who's now, of course, the most popular Transformers character. I hardly have more than half a page or a panel of Bumblebee in a story, which is just strange. And I only noticed looking back at my stories that he just doesn't feature very much. The only time we did is when we killed him off to turn him into Goldbug, because we did a slightly different version in the UK, where because that happened in a G.I. Joe series, am I right? A crossover.
I think G.I. Joe was in the G.I. Joe Transformers series introduced Goldbug. I forget
Yeah.
how.
No, I can't remember, but we weren't using that series because we had Action Force in the UK. So we did our own version of Bumblebee being kind of wrecked and then recreated as Goldbug. So that was pretty much the only time I featured him, and that was just to kill him off, really.
Oh, and by the way, Simon might be aware of this. I'm not sure if your audience is, Mike. Goldbug was Bumblebee's original name.
Hmm.
And that was one of the rejected names from that writer editor I was alluding to earlier. It was a good name, and actually it helped inspire me to come up with Bumblebee, so I'll give it credit for that. But it was just sitting there on the sideline, and then I don't remember the circumstances, but it got resurrected in the G.I. Joe Transformers miniseries.
so these books that are now being kickstarted by Skybound, they're huge. They call them compendiums. I don't know why it's not omnibus, but it's sort of this similar concept. Um, what, but I do notice when I look at the campaign that there are, maybe not all of the issues. There are certain issues. Do you know how those decisions were made, or
I thought it was all the issues. It certainly seems to be all the UK stories. Is there anything they're not running from the US side?
I don't know. I mean, I saw some numbers when they were providing it, and maybe we'll just cut the section out, but it seemed like there were a few
Well,
gaps here and there.
there are, because of my lack of wisdom about these matters, there are several issues that are problematic for other publishers to publish because they feature Marvel copyrighted characters.
Mm.
So I believe, there's been, I mean, over the last several decades, there's been several different publishers that have had the license to reprint or to print new Transformers stories as well as reprint the old Marvel stories. And I believe, on a couple of occasions, and Simon would probably know more about this than me since he's been involved, they've gotten the rights to print those books that feature the copyrighted Marvel material. But I think those publishers have to go above and beyond to get the approval to do that, and they have to pay an extra fee to use those characters. So, my impression was that this compendium is everything, but I'm not the person behind it, so I don't know.
I
But
mean,
the sticking points specifically are issue 3 featured Spider-Man, and then the introduction of the Dinobots featured the Savage Land, which was around issue 9 maybe or 8, I forget, around there. And then I created a character called Circuit Breaker, and I took extra steps to make sure Marvel retained the copyright to it in case I wanted to use it again. So in some other book. So Circuit Breaker specifically is copyrighted Marvel, and she was featured in several different issues. Um, so again, I don't know. Simon and I are not the publishing wizards who come
Yeah.
up with this stuff.
I assume I just had a quick scan and it seems to be everything because, I guess they've got some arrangement as well for Death's Head, who is
Mm.
also one of those characters we took pains to make a Marvel character.
Yeah.
Um, So, there's quite a few UK issues they'd have to skip if they didn't have that, and stories, whole stories they'd have to leave out. I mean, the only ones I can think they wouldn't reprint are the two US issues that reprinted Man of Iron. I guess there would be no point reprinting those two.
Well, for a completist, they would want everything. But
Yeah,
again, we don't make those decisions. How
no.
about pay grade?
Well, yeah, and not casting aspersions whatsoever. I mean, these are big, beautiful, comprehensive books. So I think everybody's going to be very excited to receive them. Now, if you can remember, what can we point to within these books as your one or two sort of proudest moments in writing the Transformers?
Wow. Okay. Well, I always say the same thing. This is an easy one for me. So issue 17, which is called The Smelting Pool, which introduces Blaster and introduces Cybertron into my storyline. That's my of the book of the stories that I wrote, that's my favorite story. I thought that one worked the best. Not to denigrate the others, but that one stands out for me. It was actually part one of a two-part story. I thought both parts worked pretty well, but that particular story worked best for me. So that's my high point, perhaps, and also the fact that I have a few covers that I drew that are, scattered throughout. So those are high points for me. Take it away, Si.
Yeah, for me, it's always Target 2006, which was our sort of animated movie tie-in story, because that opened up a whole, as we've discussed, a whole channel of storytelling that was somewhat unique to the UK comic. So that one, made a lot of difference. Nothing was ever the same after that. And then, when I got onto the main book, there were many issues there, but I think the one that sticks in people's minds a lot is when we crushed Megatron and Ratchet together in a space bridge accident, and they turn out, it was all a homage to David Cronenberg's The Fly, and they turn out into this crushed together sort of mind sharing being, and that one just seemed to scar a whole generation, especially the cover Andrew drew to it. So, I always tend to sort of default to that one.
Oh, and by the way, speaking of issue 17, that's where, and it was maybe 18, but that two-part story where the space bridge was introduced.
Mm,
So it lived
There
on
you
in
go.
Simon's most memorable work.
yeah, and Straxus, of course, who has become a toy and whatever else
That's right.
since.
Straxus was the character. He was the main villain of those two issues, and he was just a throw-in. I needed to create some big baddie who I could destroy without, Hasbro being upset because he was never a toy back then. But he's I guess he's been resurrected in all different forms now.
Well, as we come to a close, I'd love to know your opinion on this question, which is, what do you think made Transformers endure as a property when many other toy-based comics have been sort of left to the dustbin of history?
Okay. Should I go first? You want to go
Hmm.
first? All right. So my opinion, it's just an opinion. I haven't really done a scientific survey of all these other properties, although I was involved in a couple of other Marvel licensed properties from Hasbro and other toy companies from back in the 80s. So I have a little bit of insight into why those guys failed and Transformers may have succeeded. I think basically Transformers, two things were working for it. One is it's a wonderful toy. It's just the concept of the toy. And I know it's not unique. I know there were other toys that had similar properties of being able to transform at that time. But just the idea of, all these cool looking toys transforming from these robotic humanoid looking forms to all sorts of vehicles and other gadgets. I think it really fed the imaginations of the audience that was buying those toys back then. The kids loved them. All right. Plus, Hasbro, working with Marvel, was able to create this mythology and these characters. I had something to do with it, but so did Jim Shooter, so did Sunbow, and so on. And just make this a very exciting universe of where all sorts of wonderful stories could take place, and you meet all these crazy characters, and some are good and some are bad, and they they have distinct personalities. Hopefully, I think in a lot of cases they did, and and I think the combination of I'll use a word I learned from some Hasbro executive, the combination of how toyetic these toys were, meaning you could play with them and you get a good experience playing with them, plus they were living creatures in this world, this fictional world that was brought together by all these different entities, being me and Jim Shooter and other writers and Simon and so on and so forth. All that together, just like a perfect storm, made it a property that had legs, was able to continue even beyond its death. It got resurrected later in the 1990s. It's probably bigger than ever nowadays. So that's all I have to say. Go for it, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think, a lot of real good creativity went into that original story outline, the characters, and just the kind of the moral strand that runs right through. The backbone of it is very strong in terms of it's a battle that everyone can relate to. It has a sort of firm foundations, and everyone understands it. The villains aren't necessarily outright villains, they just have a different perspective on what they're trying to achieve. And I just think there was a lot of real good building block stuff. And then I think the other side of it is it really is a toy that keeps transforming itself for each new generation. They'll bring in a new thing that makes it relevant again, or a new, storyline that a next generation will understand and get to grips with. But if you look at any of the iterations, they go back to that first document all the time. The main sort of tent poles are all still there in every subsequent iteration of Transformers. So yeah, it's that original work that went into it and the fact that it's adaptable as a concept.
Excellent. Is there anything else you want to mention about this compendium project or any other projects coming up?
Well, we should mention that there is one sort of the pledges that has a special bookplate edition, which is signed individually. Each one is a proper signature from myself and Bob. So if you want a kind of unique version of the compendium, that's going to be as unique as it gets, I think.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but I think I looked at the Kickstarter campaign online, and there's different tiers which feature these book plates, right? And a lot of them are specific. I guess they're specific characters or something,
Mhm.
and they're sold out already. So
Yeah.
they like most of them have sold. I think most of the tiers have sold out. Most of the different book plate tiers. We haven't done any. I mean, like, speaking for myself, I'm assuming the same is true for you, Simon. We haven't done any of this work yet. So,
We're going to have a
so,
lot of signing.
so they're selling this on faith that we're actually going to come through and
Yeah.
sign these things, but we haven't seen any of this stuff yet.
Yeah.
I'm sure they did the same with you, Simon. They contacted me for a sample signature so they could
Yes.
feature it in the Kickstarter campaign, right? You probably did
Yep.
the same thing. So I
Yep.
sent them a digital signature, which they could feature on their Kickstarter page. And I saw Simon's was there too. And that's all we've done.
Yep.
So so I'm sure they will honor, their commitment to their the people who've bought their Kickstarter uh, tiers or whatever, who subscribe to it. But we haven't done the work yet.
But we will.
Yeah,
Yes.
like I guess they better just pray that we don't get hit by a train or something, because otherwise they're doomed.
Start using those hand exercisers
Oh,
so you
well,
you don't
we've
get a
had a long
cramp while
experience
signing.
doing autographs recently.
I
So
mean, I signed, and I'm sure Bob did as well, thousands of trading cards
that is
recently.
exactly correct. Like for the Dynamite Entertainment's recent Transformers set that came out, I must have signed over 8,000 cards.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and you know, what's good about it is you can watch television and find the cards. So you don't have to pay. It doesn't take a lot of focus, you know.
Right, right. Just some
So
manual
you don't,
labor.
you don't have to do them all at once, but yeah, it is a lot. But there's a lot of cards that we recently we are in practice. We've done a lot of. We're ready to do it.
Good to know. And we're back. Love talking to these two guys. They obviously had and have a passion for the Transformers, and we love to hear about all of the stories back in the day about how these storylines, these characters were developed, and the, behind the scenes intrigue, and also, what their favorite stories are and their favorite characters. And can't get enough Transformers. So thank you, Bob and Simon, for being on the show again and returning. We hope to have you again soon. Everybody out there, thank you for viewing, for listening, for rating, reviewing, subscribing, doing all the great stuff that helps get this show out to more folks. And there are plenty of other interviews coming this week. So we'll see you next issue.